He humiliated her in front of everyone. He yelled that she was fired, as if she were trash. He smiled with cruelty and superiority, unaware that he had just knelt before the most powerful woman who had ever set foot in that company. A signature from her would change everything. Monday dawned gray over Singapore, as if the sky itself knew what was about to unfold on the 38th floor of Straits Ventures Holdings corporate building. Heavy clouds hung over the skyscrapers like a warning no one had read in time. It was the kind of morning that residents of the capital knew well. The thick air, the dense traffic before 7 a.m., and that particular feeling that the day held something in its folds it wasn't yet ready to reveal. Clara Tan arrived at 7:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her usual time, with a copio in hand and a folder of financial reports under her arm. She wore a simple yet elegant royal blue dress, her brown hair loose over her shoulders, and moderate heels that resonated calmly on the marble of the lobby. There was nothing in her appearance that screamed power. That was exactly what she wanted. The building's lobby was, like all lobbies of major corporations in the financial district, an exercise in architecture designed to intimidate. White marble floors, brushed steel elevator frames, a circular reception desk with 2 assistants who smiled with the trained uniformity of those who knew their expression was part of the corporate message. Clara crossed it with the natural ease of someone who had traversed that space hundreds of times, returning good mornings with a genuine smile, not the obligatory smile practiced by executives, but that of someone who truly saw the people in front of her. For 3 years, Clara had worked at Straits Ventures Holdings as the Director of Strategic Development, an important role, but one she deliberately kept below her true weight. No one in that company, absolutely no one, except her personal lawyer and her trusted accountant, knew that Clara Tan was the silent majority shareholder of the business group that controlled 67% of the company's shares. No one knew that the woman who arrived punctually each morning with her copio was, in legal and financial terms, the owner of every desk, every chair, every square inch of that building. Daniel Chen believed was his. There was a very specific reason for this: calculated anonymity. Clara had learned from a young age, sitting in the study of her maternal grandfather, the legendary entrepreneur, Mr. Speaker, Tan Kian Huat, that true power never needed to announce itself. Her grandfather had built a silent empire for 40 years, moving capital, merging companies, and making historic decisions from the shadows, while other, louder men vied for magazine covers. The lion does not need to roar for the jungle to know who is king, he would always tell her with that steady voice Clara still heard in her dreams. The first time Clara arrived at that building for her job interview, 3 years prior, she had to make a conscious effort not to laugh. She knew every square meter of that property from the documents in her portfolio. She knew the lease agreement, the appraised value, the outstanding mortgage debt. She knew the name of the construction company that had renovated the lobby 3 years earlier, and knew they had overcharged by 40% above market price because Daniel Chen had not requested 3 quotes before signing. In contrast, the man who interviewed her that day knew absolutely nothing about her, save what her resume stated, which was impeccable but deliberately incomplete. The interview lasted 45 minutes. Daniel had delegated it to Marcus Lim, who observed her with the slight condescension of a man who believed he was doing someone a favor by hiring them. Clara answered each question with calculated precision, revealing just enough to be hired, and just enough, or less, not to raise any alarms. She left the building with a job offer in her pocket and the quiet certainty that the game had begun that morning. However, something in the building's atmosphere was different. Clara felt it before any concrete data confirmed it. It was something in the way colleagues arriving at the same time exchanged quick glances. Something in the way conversations halted mid-sentence when she approached the coffee area. Something in the particular silence that fills the air when people know things they haven't yet spoken. Years of trained observation had refined this sense into something almost physical. A subtle pressure at the base of her neck that told her the board had been moved overnight. When Mr. Tan Kian Huat died 3 years ago, he left his favorite granddaughter an inheritance that went far beyond money. He left her a philosophy, a network of contacts carefully cultivated over decades, and majority control of an investment portfolio valued at $800 million. Clara was 29 then, with an MBA from London and the cold blood of someone who had learned to observe before acting. The decision to infiltrate Straits Ventures Holdings had not been capricious. Her grandfather had been a co-founder of that company decades ago, before a series of murky maneuvers executed by Daniel Chen's father had pushed him out of the partnership under conditions that were never entirely clear. Mr. Tan had never sought revenge. but he had maintained an equity stake through a complex structure of funds and trusts that Daniel Chen didn't even know existed. Clara had inherited those shares, along with a handwritten message from her grandfather that simply said, "Observe, learn, decide when the time comes." That moment, Clara felt in her bones, was drawing closer. As she crossed the lobby towards the elevators, Sarah Lim, her assistant and one of the few people she trusted implicitly, intercepted her with an expression Clara recognized immediately. It was the face Sarah made when the news was not good. Sarah was 31, with black hair pulled back in a low ponytail, and that particular ability some people possess to be completely invisible when they wanted to be, and completely present when the situation demanded it. She was one of the smartest people Clara had ever met, and that morning her eyes carried something urgent. "Good morning. I need to tell you something before you go up," Sarah said in a low voice, walking beside her with quick, discreet steps. "Tell me," Clara replied, without altering her pace or expression. "Daniel called an emergency meeting for 9 a.m. You're not on the list of attendees." Sarah paused briefly. "But that's not all. Last night there was a private meeting at his penthouse with Marcus Lim and 2 corporate lawyers from Malaysia, whom no one knows." Clara processed that information as she pressed the elevator button. Marcus Lim was the CFO, an ambitious and perfectly pliable man who had been orbiting Danielle for months, like a satellite without a will of his own. The unknown lawyers were a new variable that deserved attention. "Do you know what the meeting was about?" Clara asked, with the same calm with which she might have inquired about the weather. "Not for certain," Sarah admitted. But Daphne, Marcus's assistant, overheard fragments. Apparently, they're preparing an organizational restructuring, eliminating directorial positions deemed redundant. The elevator doors opened. Clara stepped in, turned, and for a second, Sarah saw something cross her boss's eyes. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. The look of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion she had harbored for a long time. "It's all right," Clara said simply. "Thank you, Sarah." The doors closed in the silence of the elevator. As the floor numbers advanced, Clara closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. It was a habit she had developed in moments of greatest tension. 3 seconds of absolute silence to organize her thoughts and remember what her grandfather had taught her. Never react, respond. There is an enormous difference between the two. When the doors opened on the 38th floor, Clara Tan exited with the same serene step with which she had entered. No one who saw her walk down that glass-walled corridor, greeting arriving colleagues with a calm smile, would have guessed that her mind was already processing scenarios with the calculated precision of a grandmaster of chess. The workday began seemingly normally. Clara attended 2 team meetings, reviewed financial projections for the 3rd quarter, and responded to emails with her usual efficiency. From her vantage point, during the 9 a.m. meeting, she could see through the glass wall into the room where Daniel had convened his meeting without including her. Gestures were contained, faces serious, and Marcus Lim took notes with a diligence Clara correctly interpreted as the diligence of someone documenting a decision already made, not debating it. But beneath that surface of professional normality, her senses were completely alert, registering every detail, every evasive glance, every conversation abruptly interrupted when she approached. It was 11:23 a.m. when the doors of the main boardroom swung open, and Daniel Chen's voice cut across the entire floor like a gunshot. "Clara Tan, in my office now." The entire floor froze. 34 people looked up from their screens simultaneously. The silence that fell was so dense and sudden that it could be physically felt as a pressure in the ears. Someone in the finance area inadvertently dropped a pen. The sound of that pen falling to the floor was perfectly audible throughout the space. Clara placed her copio on her desk with a measured movement. She stood up unhurriedly. She buttoned the second button of her blazer with a precise and natural gesture and walked towards Daniel Chen's office with the same calm with which she would have walked to any ordinary Tuesday meeting. No one on that floor knew at that moment that they were witnessing the beginning of the end. Daniel Chen's office was exactly the kind of space an insecure man builds when he suddenly has too much money and too little personal history to back up his position. Walls paneled in dark imported timber, a collection of corporate trophies aligned with surgical vanity, and a black walnut desk that cost more than the combined annual salaries of 3 of his employees. Behind that desk, Daniel Chen stood like an animal that had spent all morning preparing for this moment. Framed photographs hung on the walls where he appeared alongside politicians, famous entrepreneurs, business celebrities. Each image was a statement, proof that he belonged to that world, that his surname was not just a name, but a credential. But for a trained observer like Clara, This abundance of proof communicated exactly the opposite of what it intended. No one who truly belonged in a place needed to demonstrate so insistently that they belonged. He was 44, with a square jaw, black hair perfectly slicked back, with an almost ridiculous amount of product, and the particular smile of men who confuse cruelty with strength. He had inherited the Chen surname from a father who built the company with questionable methods, and had also inherited that philosophy that power is exercised by humiliating, not inspiring. For Daniel, every employee was a replaceable piece on a board he controlled, and he enjoyed reminding them of it regularly. When Clara entered the office, what she found did not surprise her. Daniel was standing by the panoramic window, hands clasped behind his back, in the studied pose of someone who had rehearsed this scene several times. To his right was Markus Lim, the CFO, with a folder under his arm, and eyes fixed on the floor, with the characteristic cowardice of men who participate in others' cruelty to feel powerful without assuming personal responsibility. On the side sofa were two men Clara didn't immediately recognize, suited, with leather briefcases, the type of lawyers who charged by the hour and didn't ask awkward questions. But what Clara did not expect was the additional audience. Because Daniel, in a gesture that perfectly revealed the depth of his need for validation, had left the glass doors of his office completely open. Outside, the entire floor could see and hear everything that was about to unfold. 34 people, with eyes fixed on that scene as if it were an accident they couldn't look away from. Daniel wanted witnesses. He needed an audience for his spectacle. It was a pattern Clara had observed repeatedly for 3 years. The need to humiliate in public, to make another's pain visible, as if shared cruelty somehow multiplied the power of the one who wielded it. She had documented at least 8 similar instances in that time. Employees reprimanded in front of their teams, decisions announced at the moment of greatest public impact. It was the personal signature of a man who confused others' fear with genuine respect. "Close the door, please," Clara said with absolute calm upon entering. "No," Daniel replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I want everyone to hear this. It's a lesson that serves any team well." Clara processed that information in less than a second and made her decision equally fast. She wouldn't insist. If he wanted an audience, he would have an audience. But the story that audience would remember wouldn't necessarily be the one Daniel was planning to tell. She stopped 1.5 meters from the desk, crossed her hands in front of her with a serene gesture, and waited. She did not sit, although there was a chair available in front of the desk. Remaining standing was a tactical decision Daniel probably didn't grasp, but which clearly communicated that she was not there to receive a sentence. She was there to listen to a man who was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. 3 years, Daniel began, walking slowly around the desk towards her, hands still clasped behind his back. 3 years you've been in this company, Clara, and in 3 years, do you know what I've observed? She didn't respond. She knew the question was rhetorical. I've observed a woman who works correctly, punctual, organized, technically capable. He paused dramatically, a pause he had clearly rehearsed. But I've also observed someone who doesn't fit the vision I have for this company in its next stage of growth. Someone whose profile is no longer compatible with the level of ambition Straits Ventures Holdings requires for the next 5 years. It was the corporate language of cowards. Words designed to sound rational while executing something completely personal and arbitrary. Could you be more specific? Clara asked, with the same calm with which she might ask for a restaurant menu to be explained. The question visibly irritated Daniel. He expected tears, or at least nervousness. Clara's serenity destabilized him in a way he couldn't name, but which he felt as a physical discomfort in his chest. Men like Daniel had built their identity on the reactions of others. His power existed to the extent that others recognized it with fear or submission. The absence of that reaction was disorienting in a way he had no tools to process. "Specific?" he repeated, and his tone grew harsher, dropping the mask of corporate language. "All right, I'll be specific. The Southeast Asia Market Expansion Project, which I assigned to you 4 months ago, came in with a 12% projection deficit. That cost me a very uncomfortable conversation with my investors last week. The projection deficit was a direct consequence of the budget cuts you yourself authorized in February," Clara replied, without raising her voice. "It's documented in the memo from the 14th. I sent it to you personally." A muscle in Daniel's jaw tightened. Markus Lim studied the floor with renewed intensity. The two lawyers on the sofa exchanged a fleeting glance that none of the 3 men present caught, but which Clara registered with perfect clarity. It was the look of 2 professionals who had just realized that the person in front of them was more complicated than they had been informed. "What's documented," Daniel said, and his voice rose a notch in volume, "is a pattern of results that doesn't justify the cost of maintaining your position in this structure. What's documented is that this company needs people with real hunger, not people who settle for just enough." "I understand," Clara said simply. And that was all. 2 words, no additional defense, no new argument, no visible emotion. Just 2 words that somehow sounded more forceful than any speech she could have delivered. In the office outside, someone audibly held their breath. Sarah, from her desk, had her eyes fixed on the scene with an intensity that hurt her chest. Daniel interpreted them as surrender. He was profoundly mistaken. "Good," he said. And at that moment, he turned towards the open door, towards the audience observing from outside with bated breath, and raised his voice with the deliberation of someone who wanted every syllable to reach the farthest corner of the floor. "Then consider this officially notified. Effective immediately, Clara Tan, you are dismissed from Straits Ventures Holdings. Marcus will provide you with the corresponding documents. You have until 2 p.m. to collect your personal belongings and surrender your access card." The silence that followed was different from before. It was the heavy, uncomfortable silence of people who had just witnessed something they knew was wrong but didn't know how to name. Outside, no one moved, no one spoke. Sarah, from her desk, had her hand over her mouth, her eyes shining with a mixture of indignation and contained anguish. Daniel smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he had won. Clara looked at him for exactly 3 seconds in silence. Those 3 seconds she used to order her inner world before responding. Then she nodded once, with a slowness that had something ceremonial about it, and said in a voice perfectly audible to everyone listening outside, "All right, Daniel. Thank you for the clarity." She turned, walked towards the door with a calm, steady pace, and as she crossed the threshold into the open floor, where 34 pairs of eyes watched her with a mixture of pity and astonishment, Clara Tan did something no one expected. She smiled. It was not the smile of someone defeated. It was something else entirely. It was the quiet, confident smile of someone who had just seen her opponent move exactly the piece she needed him to move. It was the smile of a chess player who had been anticipating for 20 moves the moment her opponent, convinced he was winning, would reach for the wrong piece. Daniel Chen, standing by his panoramic window, watching her walk away, felt for a fraction of a second something he couldn't identify, a strange discomfort, a shadow of doubt that crossed his mind and disappeared before he could examine it. He didn't examine it. He should have. There was a small kopitiam 2 blocks from the Straits Ventures Holdings corporate building, an unpretentious place called MDM, Go's noodle stall, with worn wooden tables, genuine kopio, and a 60-year-old owner who knew all her regulars by name. It was the kind of place executives from the building never visited because it lacked an Instagrammable terrace or an English menu. That was exactly why Clara had chosen it as her personal sanctuary from her first month of work. MDM. Go herself was a petite woman with salt and pepper hair and hands that had worked a lifetime, possessing that particular kindness of those who had learned that goodness was more sustainable than any other stance in the world. When Clara entered that morning, MDM. Go looked at her for a second, said nothing, and simply placed the kopio on the counter before Clara even ordered it. There was something in that silent gesture, in that way of seeing without asking, that Clara appreciated with an intensity words could not capture. She sat at the back table, her usual spot, ordered a black coffee without sugar, and took out her phone. She had 4 messages from Sarah, 2 missed calls from Daphne, and a voicemail from someone identified in her contacts simply as DL. She listened to that last one first. The voice that came through the earpiece was that of an older man, measured and precise, with the particular accent of someone from a northern state of Malaysia that Clara irremediably associated with the most solid memories of her childhood. It was Mr. David Lee, the personal lawyer who had served her grandfather, Mr. Tan Kian Huat, for 32 years, and who was now the sole complete custodian of the legal architecture supporting Clara's true power. "Clara, I just received notification of the movement. When you want to talk, I'm here. And remember, Clara, as Mr. Tan always used to say, the time to act is not when you're angry, it's when you're ready." Clara listened to the message twice, then saved it, took a sip of her kopio, and for the next 4 minutes simply looked out the window at the street, observing the ordinary movement of the city, as if needing to remember that the world continued to spin with perfect indifference to the corporate dramas on the 38th floor. A delivery truck temporarily blocked the right lane. A woman crossed the street with a market bag. A child in a school uniform ran towards a bus stop. The city, indifferent and alive, remained the city. Then she called Sarah. "Are you all right?" was the first thing Sarah asked with that characteristic blend of loyalty and urgency. "Perfectly," Clara replied. "I need you to do 3 things. First, don't collect anything from my office yet. Second, call Daphne and tell her to be calm, not to talk to anyone about last night. Third, in the gray filing cabinet you have the key to. Find the navy blue folder with the Tan Kian Huat Investments Pte Limited letterhead. Keep it in your bag and don't let it go." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Clara," Sarah said in a lower voice, "what's really going on? You've been my boss for 3 years, and I've never seen you like this. Not when Daniel cut your budget in February, nor when Marcus took credit for the North project. Today something is different." Clara considered the question with honesty. Sarah had been by her side for 3 years, with a loyalty she had genuinely earned, silently covering angles. Clara couldn't cover alone, guarding information with the discretion of someone who understood that important things weren't said out loud. She deserved a real answer. "Very soon I will explain everything," Clara said. "Finally, what I need you to know right now is that what happened today is not the end of anything. It's the beginning of something that has been 3 years in the making." Sarah processed that in silence for a moment. "Understood," she finally said. "The blue folder will be in my bag in 10 minutes. Clara hung up and finished her copio. To understand what Clara was about to do, it was necessary to understand where she came from. Not the Clara whom Daniel Chen believed he knew, but the real Clara, the one who existed before the blue dress, before the title of Director of Strategic Development, before the glass building in Singapore. Clara Lucia Tan Carrillo had been born in Singapore, the only child of Patricia Tan, Mr. Tan Kian Huat's youngest daughter, and Alex Fuentes, an architect of moderate talent and excessive ambition, who abandoned the family when Clara was 7, with no more explanation than a note on the kitchen table. Patricia never spoke of him with bitterness, which taught Clara something valuable about silent dignity. Her father's absence had left a wound Clara didn't often name, but which had profoundly shaped her character. Absolute independence, distrust of easy promises, the certainty that the only solid foundation is the one built with one's own hands. She grew up between 2 worlds that seemed incompatible. At home, the calculated modesty of her mother, who worked as a mathematics teacher in a public school and managed every dollar with surgical precision, and on weekends at her grandfather, Mr. Tan Kian Huat's house, where the scale of things was radically different, not in terms of ostentation, because Mr. Tan Kian Huat despised ostentation with the same intensity with which he despised mediocrity, but in terms of perspective. In that house, she learned to read financial statements before she learned to drive. She learned that a negotiating table was a theater, and that the actor who controlled their emotions always had an advantage over the one who showed them. She learned that strategic silence communicated more than any argument. On Saturday afternoons, when other children her age watched television or played in the park, Clara sat in her grandfather's study and listened to him talk about companies, markets, decisions that had built or destroyed fortunes. Mr. Tan never simplified things for her. He treated her as a serious interlocutor from the age of 8. He answered her questions honestly and corrected her when her reasoning had flaws. "A mind that is not exercised atrophies," he would say. "And a mind that gets used to being told what it wants to hear is a mind that is no longer useful for anything important." At 17, Clara won a full scholarship to study economics at the National University of Singapore. At 22, she graduated with honors. At 24, she completed an MBA at the London School of Economics with a thesis on investment structures in emerging Southeast Asian markets that was cited in 3 international academic publications. She returned to Singapore at 25 with formidable technical knowledge and the particular serenity of someone who had learned to move comfortably in very different worlds. When her grandfather died at 83, 3 years ago, he did so with the same elegance with which he had lived no drama, no grandiloquent final speeches, just a quiet afternoon in his garden, a last conversation with Clara that lasted 2 hours, and then a sleep from which he did not awaken. In that final conversation, Mr. Tan had explained with clinical and affectionate detail the complete architecture of what he was leaving her. The funds, the trusts, the shareholdings in 19 different companies, and among them, the 67% stake in Straits Ventures Holdings, hidden behind 4 layers of corporate structures that made it impossible to trace without knowing exactly where to look. Old Mr. Chen forced me out of that company with tricks, her grandfather had told her with a calm that only years could bring. but he could never take my shares because he never knew I had them. You decide what you do with it, Clara. I don't ask for vengeance. I ask for intelligence. Clara had chosen intelligence. She had designed a meticulous plan that required time, observation, and patience. Entering the company as a director had given her 3 years of privileged access to internal information, power dynamics, structural weaknesses, and, crucially, Danielle Chen's behavioral patterns. She had documented minor accounting irregularities. She had identified 3 contracts signed under conditions that bordered on fraudulent. She had silently and precisely built a case. The only thing she needed was the right detonator. And this morning, unknowingly, without being able to imagine it in his worst nightmare, Danielle Chen had personally handed it to her. By being fired in front of 34 witnesses, Danielle had activated a specific clause in the shareholder agreement that Mr. Lee had pointed out months ago with a quiet smile. Any direct action by executive management against a majority shareholder, including the arbitrary termination of an employment contract, granted, said shareholder, the immediate right to convene an extraordinary general meeting with urgent character. Daniel had shouted, "You're fired," unaware that he was actually signing the order for his own dismissal. Clara left the exact amount for her copio on the table, stood up, and left MDM, Go's noodle stall for the grey morning light of Singapore. She had calls to make, a board to reorganize, and for the first time in 3 years, exactly the piece she needed to begin the endgame. Before making the first call, she stood for a moment longer on the sidewalk in front of Mediem, Go's noodle stall, with the cold morning wind stirring her hair. Mediem, Go watched her from inside the shop with that instinct some older people had for knowing when something important was happening without needing the details. When their glances crossed through the glass, MDM, Go raised her hand slightly, not exactly a wave, but something more akin to the gesture of someone saying, "Go." Clara nodded and walked. Mr. David Lee's office was located in a discreet building near Raffles Place, without flashy signs or glossy magazine receptionists. A small bronze plaque by the door, with the text "Lee and Associates, Legal Consultancy," was all that identified the place from the street. It was exactly the kind of discretion his clientele demanded, and that Mr. Lee had cultivated over 4 decades of professional practice. Clara arrived at 12:40 p.m. Mr. Lee waited for her standing by his desk, with that erect posture he maintained at 71 as if time had spared his back, in recognition of a lifetime of honest work. He was a thin man, with completely white hair, thin-rimmed glasses, and a gaze that assessed situations with the quiet speed of someone who had seen too many crises to be agitated by any. He had served Mr. Tan Kian Huat for over 3 decades, and in that time, he had learned to recognize in Clara the same inner architecture as her grandfather, the calm, the precision, the ability to see beyond the immediate present without losing touch with it. He greeted her with a firm handshake and led her directly to the inner workroom, a windowless room with walls covered in filing cabinets and a long oak table on which several folders were already arranged with meticulous precision. "Tell me exactly how it happened, Mr. Lee said, sitting opposite her and opening his notebook with the automatic gesture of someone who had heard thousands of life-changing stories. Clara narrated the facts with the precision of a report. No emotional embellishments, no digressions. Danielle Chen had summoned her to his office with the doors open before witnesses and had uttered the words of dismissal loudly and clearly before a minimum of 30 people. Marcus Lim had been present as a corporate witness. The documents had been prepared in advance, indicating premeditation. Mr. Lee listened without interruption, making brief notes in small, uniform handwriting. When Clara finished, he remained silent for exactly long enough to complete his last annotation. Then he looked up and gazed at her with an expression that, for him, amounted to a full smile. He activated. "Clause 14B, he said simply. "That's what I concluded too," Clara replied. "Not just 14B. Mr. Lee opened the first folder and slid 3 printed sheets with the Tan Kian Huat, Investments Pty Limited, letterhead towards Clara. What he did this morning also constitutes a direct violation of Article 32 of the Shareholders' Agreement, which expressly prohibits disciplinary actions against persons linked to founding shareholders without prior notification to the board. You were registered in the system as an external consultant for Tan Kian Huat Investments for 18 months, Clara. Daniel didn't know because he never read the full records of current contracts. That makes it a double violation." Clara looked at the documents. Everything was there, clean and documented, with dates, signatures, and notarial seals that turned what Daniel had done this morning into a legal catastrophe of considerable proportions. "How much time do we need to convene the extraordinary general meeting?" Clara asked. With Clause 14b activated, the regulations establish a maximum of 72 hours for formal convocation. But there's something even more interesting. Mr. Lee opened the second folder. "I've been reviewing the internal financial movements you sent me in January for 3 weeks. I found something I didn't expect." What Mr. Lee had found was a series of transfers made over the past 8 months between Straits Ventures Holdings operating account and a shell company registered in Panama under the name VR International Construction PT Limited. The total accumulated amount was $4,300,000. The recipient company had no registered employees, no verifiable assets, no documented construction contracts, but it had 2 registered partners, whose names Clara recognized immediately: Daniel Chen and Marcus Lim. Clara read the documents twice in complete silence, then carefully placed them on the table and remained for a moment staring at a fixed point on the wall in front of her, processing the magnitude of what she held in her hands. It was not just a minor accounting irregularity like the ones she had documented before. It was corporate fraud company money. Money that for the most part belonged to its shareholders, being systematically diverted to personal accounts disguised under an offshore structure. The coldness of the operation was what impressed her most. 17 transfers in 8 months. Amounts carefully calibrated not to exceed automatic review thresholds, a screen company with an appearance of legitimacy. Someone had planned this methodically. "How solid is the evidence?" she finally asked. "Solid enough to present to a high court judge," Mr. Lee replied without hesitation. "I have the bank statements, transfer records, incorporation documents for the Panamanian company, and a preliminary statement from an external auditor who reviewed the numbers independently. If you decide to go the criminal route, in addition to the corporate one, Daniel Chen faces charges that go far beyond losing his position in the company." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that precedes important decisions. Clara thought of her grandfather. She thought of their final conversation in the garden on that afternoon that smelled of jasmine and damp earth, of Mr. Tan's measured voice telling her, "I ask for intelligence, not vengeance." She thought of the difference between the two and the exact point where they sometimes touched. "We go the corporate route first," Clara decided. "Extraordinary general meeting, convened for within 48 hours. We present the evidence of fraud to the board. Before involving any external authority, Daniel will have the opportunity to respond. What he does with that opportunity will determine our subsequent steps." Mr. Lee nodded with the silent approval of someone who recognized a well-calibrated decision. "As you say, I'll start preparing the convocation documents this afternoon." "There's one more thing," Clara said. "I need the convocation to reach Daniel Chen in a specific way, not by corporate email, not through intermediaries. I want it delivered in a physical envelope with certified personal delivery tomorrow morning directly into his hands in his office, in front of his staff." Mr. Lee raised an eyebrow. It was the maximum gesture of expressiveness he allowed himself. "What time?" 9 a.m., Clara said. "Exactly the same time he usually makes his rounds on the floors, greeting his team. It seems fair that he receives his notification under the same conditions in which he delivered mine." Mr. Lee was silent for a moment, and then, for the first time in the conversation, he smiled. It was a small, controlled, but genuine smile. "Mr. Tan would have said exactly the same thing," Mr. Lee murmured, almost to himself, as he opened his notebook again to take the final note of the meeting. It was the only personal reference he allowed himself that afternoon, and Clara received it with the same silence with which one receives things too important to surround with words. Mr. Lee had been the silent guardian of the Tan family's history for 32 years. And in those 3 decades, he had seen enough to know that the truly important moments in people's lives didn't arrive with fanfare. They arrived with the same calm with which that day had arrived in a windowless room, with documents on the table, and 2 people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. That was enough. That was, in fact, all that was needed. That afternoon, while Mr. Lee and his team worked on preparing the documents, Clara made 3 additional calls that completed the board. The first was to Sarah, to coordinate the logistical details for the next day and ensure the blue folder was safe. The second was to Daphne Lee, Marcus Lim's assistant, a young woman who had been feeling uncomfortable for months with things she had seen and heard at work, but didn't know whom to tell. Clara listened to her for 20 minutes with genuine attention. Daphne spoke with the accumulated urgency of someone who had kept something heavy for too long. In the end, Clara simply told her that if she was willing to sign a statement of what she had observed, her position in the company under the new administration would be completely guaranteed. Daphne took less than 10 seconds to respond yes. The third call was to a number Clara rarely dialed, saved in her phone under the name Mariana. It wasn't just Mariana, her childhood friend and the person she trusted most in the world. It was also Mariana Wong, corporate communications director of one of the country's most important media groups, with access to platforms that could turn a story into a national conversation in less than 24 hours. "I need to ask you a favor," Clara said when Mariana answered. "You haven't asked me for one in 3 years," Mariana replied from the other end. "That means this one must be good." "It's the best one I'm going to ask you in my life," Clara said with the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since morning. Daniel Chen at that moment was in his office on the 38th floor, celebrating with Marcus Lim what he believed was a clean and definitive victory. No one had told him anything to cause concern. Everything seemed to be exactly under his control. The board, however, was already completely different from the one he believed he was looking at. Tuesday dawned with unexpectedly clear sun over Singapore, as if the weather had decided to side with the right side of history. At 8:47 AM, a messenger in a formal uniform and a black leather briefcase entered the lobby of the Straits Ventures Holdings corporate building with a sealed envelope and the precise instruction to deliver it personally to Mr. Daniel Chen, CEO. No exceptions or acceptable substitutes. The messenger was a man of about 50 with the calm efficiency of someone who had delivered important news throughout a professional life and had learned that the best way to do so was without drama or commentary, simply the task executed with precision. The receptionist called Daniel's personal assistant, who called Daniel, who came down to the lobby with the characteristic irritation of someone who didn't understand why his communication filters hadn't worked correctly. He arrived in the lobby in his shirt sleeves, his tie knot still unadjusted. At the exact moment, several employees were crossing the lobby towards the elevators to begin their workday. The messenger verified his identity with a document in hand, obtained his signature on the acknowledgement of receipt, handed him the envelope, and withdrew with the same silent efficiency with which he had arrived. Daniel looked at the envelope. On the front, in sober and precise typography, it read, "Formal notification, Extraordinary General Meeting of Shareholders, Tan Kian Huat. Investments Pte Limited, C. Oli and Associates. Legal Consultancy." The name Tan Kian Huat. Investments took exactly 4 seconds to register in Daniel's mind. 4 seconds, in which his expression shifted from irritation to bewilderment, from bewilderment to a deeper, less comfortable confusion. He knew that name. He had seen it in corporate documents years ago, vaguely associated with the company's ancient history, his father's time, but he had never paid it any real attention because he had never had reason to. He went up to the 38th floor with the envelope in his hand and opened it in his office with Marcus Lim present, this time closing the door completely. No audience, no theater. What he found inside drained the color from his face in less than 2 minutes of reading. The document was a formal convocation to an extraordinary general meeting of shareholders scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m., signed by Mr. David Lee on behalf of Tan Kian Huat Investments Pte Limited, holder of 67% of the ordinary shares of Straits Ventures Holdings. The agenda included 3 points: review of current executive management, presentation of documented financial irregularities in the recent period, and a vote on modifications to the company's executive structure. Daniel read the document 3 times, then laid it on his desk and looked at Marcus with an expression the latter had never seen before. It wasn't the calculated fury Marcus knew well. It was something different. It was the particular expression of a man who had just realized that the ground he thought was solid beneath his feet had been something else entirely for some time. "What is Tan Kian Huat?" "Investments," Daniel asked with a minimum of enthusiasm, his voice lower than usual. Marcus Lim, whose primary competence was reading Daniel's mood to accommodate it, recognized that this situation was outside the manual of anything he had handled before. "I don't know for certain," he admitted. "But wasn't Tan the maternal surname of old Mr. Tan, your father's original partner?" The silence that followed was enough of an answer. Meanwhile, on the 38th floor, the morning passed with a new tension everyone felt, but no one named. Clara's absence was a physical space that the atmosphere filled with quiet speculation. Several colleagues had exchanged messages through internal channels, wondering if what had happened the previous day was true, if Clara had really been fired, if anyone knew anything more. Sarah attended her desk with a calm that was difficult to maintain, aware of every movement, every conversation, every glance that crossed the floor. At 10:15, her phone vibrated with a message from Clara. 2 words only. It's arrived. Sarah closed her eyes for a second and exhaled slowly. Clara spent Tuesday morning in Mr. Lee's office, reviewing every document, every figure, every argument that would be presented at Thursday's assembly. It was meticulous, unglamorous work, the kind of preparation that determines whether a battle is won before it begins or improvised at the moment. Clara preferred the first option with a conviction her grandfather had instilled in her since childhood. The fraud was documented with a solidity that left no room for favorable interpretations. $4,300,000 diverted over 8 months to an offshore company with no real activity. The records were clean, the dates matched. The authorizing signatures on the transfers unambiguously belonged to Daniel Chen and Marcus Lim. The external auditor had submitted his report in writing. Daphne had signed her testimonial statement the previous afternoon with slightly trembling hands, but with a determination Clara had silently respected. At midday, Mariana called from her office at the media group. "I have 2 journalists specializing in corporate business who want the story," she said without preamble. "But I need to know when I can give them the green light." "After the assembly," Clara replied. "Not before. I want this to be resolved first in its proper corporate space. If Daniel accepts the terms, the story can be handled with discretion. If he decides to fight, then let the world know exactly what happened and why." "Understood," Mariana said. And then, with the confidence of 27 years of friendship, "Are you all right, Cami?" Clara considered the question with honesty. "I am exactly where I need to be," she finally replied. What happened that afternoon on the 38th floor reached Clara's ears through Sarah, in 3 successive messages that painted the picture with sufficient detail. Daniel had urgently summoned his corporate lawyers. The meeting had lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Upon leaving, the lawyers had the particular expression of professionals who had just confirmed bad news they already suspected. Daniel had cancelled all his afternoon meetings. Marcus Lim had left the building at 4 p.m. with a cardboard box containing personal items from his office, which in corporate nonverbal language meant exactly what it appeared to mean. Sarah's last message read, "Daniel has been locked in for 3 hours. His assistant says he hasn't even come out to eat. I've never seen him like this." Clara read the message, put down her phone on Mr. Lee's desk, and looked out the only interior window, which overlooked a small courtyard with a bougainvillea plant, climbing the wall with a silent, vegetal tenacity. She thought of her grandfather, of the garden at their home in Singapore, of the smell of jasmine and damp earth on that last afternoon together, of the way Mr. Tan Kian Huat had spent 40 years building something in silence, with patience, with intelligence, without needing anyone to see or recognize him along the way. The time to act is not when you're angry, it's when you're ready. She was ready. On Thursday at 10 a.m., Daniel Chen would sit across from her in a boardroom and hear the full truth about what he had built, what he had destroyed, and what had belonged to others long before he uttered his surname, as if it were a title of ownership. But that night, before Thursday arrived, something happened that Clara had not calculated, something that changed the temperature of everything that was to come in a way no legal document or corporate strategy could have predicted. At 9:47 p.m., her phone rang with an unsaved number. She let it ring. It rang again. She let it ring again. On the 3rd attempt, something perhaps the intuition cultivated over years of observing patterns made her answer. The voice on the other end was Daniel Chen's, but it was not the voice that had shouted, "You're fired," in front of 34 witnesses. It was a different voice, lower, more human. The voice of a man who had spent hours sitting in the darkness of his own office and had finally reached the edge of something resembling understanding. "Clara," he simply said, "I need to speak with you." Clara held the phone in silence for 3 full seconds after hearing her name in Daniel's voice. 3 seconds that probably felt like 3 minutes to him, and that for her were enough to make a decision her instinct dictated with unusual clarity. "I'm listening," she finally said. There was a long pause on the other end, the kind of pause made by men who have spent their lives speaking from a position of power and who suddenly find themselves without the firm ground of that position beneath their feet, not knowing exactly how language works when one is not at an advantage. "I don't want to talk on the phone," Daniel said. "Could you meet me tonight? If possible, a neutral place, a restaurant in the CBD, the Compass Room. You probably know it. Private, discreet, just a conversation." Clara considered the request. The Compass Room was a restaurant she indeed knew. One of those places with white tablecloths and dim lighting, where business people had conversations they couldn't have in their offices. Discreet to the point of opacity, exactly the kind of setting Daniel would choose for a negotiation he didn't want anyone to witness. Her instinct for caution told her to wait until Thursday, to maintain the planned schedule, not to alter the structure of what was already perfectly prepared. But there was something in Daniel's voice, something that wasn't manipulation or tactics, something that sounded genuinely different from anything she had heard from him in 3 years, that made her respond in a way that surprised even her own sense of strategy. "An hour," Clara said. "At 11 p.m., the compass room." The compass room at 11 p.m. was exactly what Clara expected. Well-separated tables, lighting that favored privacy, service so discreet that the waiters seemed to move on another plane of existence. Daniel was already seated when she arrived, at a table in the back, without a tie for the first time she could remember, with a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. He had visibly aged in a day, not in his physical features, but in something more difficult to name in his posture, in the way his eyes looked at the table, with the heaviness of someone who had been carrying something for hours and still didn't know where to put it down. What struck Clara upon seeing him wasn't pity. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who had studied a person for 3 years and suddenly saw him without the armor he always wore. Daniel Chen, without his stage power, was a 4-year-old man, with pronounced dark circles under his eyes, and an expression that mixed exhaustion with something dangerously close to genuine shame. She sat opposite him without saying anything. She clasped her hands on the table and waited. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said. The phrase sounded strange in his mouth. It was the kind of phrase he didn't use with people he considered subordinates, and the fact that he said it communicated more than any argument that could follow. "You said you needed to talk," Clara replied simply. Daniel looked at the table for a moment, then raised his eyes to her with a direct gaze. "My lawyers explained the complete situation to me this afternoon. The shareholding structure, Clause 14b, the implications of Article 32. They explained what Tan Kian Huat Investments means and its relationship with Mr. Tan Kian Huat." He paused. "They also explained what they found in the financial records of the last 8 months. The silence that followed was one that didn't need to be filled. I want to understand something," Daniel continued, and his voice now had a different register, lower and more honest than any tone Clara had heard from him before. "How long have you known who you are in relation to this company?" "Since before I joined," Clara replied directly. Daniel processed that with an expression that went through several layers in a few seconds. "And the 3 years working here were part of a plan?" "They were part of an informed decision," Clara said. "I inherited a majority stake in a company I didn't know from the inside. Before exercising any rights over it, I wanted to understand exactly what it was, how it worked, who ran it, and in what direction it was going. 3 years of direct observation gave me that information with a clarity no external report could have given me." Daniel listened in silence. Then he said something Clara didn't expect. "And what did you find?" The question surprised her with its naked honesty. It wasn't a tactical question. It was the question of someone who genuinely wanted to know how others' eyes had seen him for 3 years. Clara considered how much truth to give him. She decided the situation deserved the full truth. "I found a company with solid fundamentals and real potential that is being systematically limited by a management culture based on fear and humiliation. I found talented teams operating below their capacity because no one has given them reasons to give more than the bare minimum. I found financial irregularities that started small and grew into a problem that is no longer manageable in silence. And I found," she paused briefly, "a man who inherited his father's surname along with his methods and who apparently never asked himself if he wanted to be different." The impact of that last sentence landed with surgical precision. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked at the glass of water, slowly twirling it between his fingers, and when he spoke again, his voice had a different texture, rougher and more real. "My father was a man who believed respect was earned through fear," he said. "I grew up believing that was leadership." Another pause. "I'm not asking you to justify anything. I'm just telling you because I think you deserve to know." There was something in that moment that Clara had not anticipated in any of her scenarios. The conversation had shifted from a strategic negotiation to something more uncomfortable and real. Two people looking into each other's eyes in an empty restaurant at midnight with the history of a company and 2 families. Between them, like an object neither could completely ignore. Clara looked at him in silence for a moment. There was something genuine in that confession, in a way that disarmed, without eliminating the clarity about what needed to happen. "What do you want from this conversation, Daniel?" she asked directly. He put the glass on the table. I want to know if there's a way out that doesn't completely destroy everything salvageable in this company. I'm not asking you to make the consequences disappear. I know that's not possible or fair. I'm asking if there's a way to do what you have to do without turning it into a war that harms the 300 people who work in that building and who have no responsibility for what Marcus and I did. It was the first time Clara had heard Daniel Chen use the word responsibility in the first person without corporate circumlocution. She looked at him with the same attention with which she had learned to read financial statements, seeking the internal consistency of the numbers, the place where logic held or broke. What she found was not a redeemed man. Redemption, if it came, was a job of years, not a night of crisis. But she found something she also didn't expect to find. A man who was looking at his own reflection without looking away, probably for the first time in a long time. The assembly will be held on Thursday as scheduled, Clara said with absolute firmness. That does not change. The evidence of fraud will be presented to the full board. That also does not change. What can change, depending on what happens in that room, is how this is handled externally and the specific terms of the transition. What kind of terms? Daniel asked. We will discuss that on Thursday, Clara replied, standing up. But I tell you one thing tonight, Daniel, and I want you to listen carefully. The 300 people who work in that building have been giving their best every morning, despite a culture that minimizes them. They deserve a different company, and that different company, with or without your cooperation, will exist. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, and before walking away from the table, she paused for a moment and looked at him one last time. Come on Thursday, prepared to be honest. That's all I ask. She walked towards the exit of the compass room without looking back, into the clear night of Singapore, with the exact weight of what was coming resting on her shoulders, with a solidity that was not a burden, but purpose. Thursday would change everything, and this time, unlike Monday, everyone in that room would know exactly who Clara Tan was. Daniel remained seated at that table in the compass room for a time he couldn't measure. The restaurant slowly emptied around him, the last diners paying their bills, the waiters beginning the silent routine of closing. No one asked him if he needed anything else. At some point, without having made a conscious decision to move, he found himself on the street with the cold of the early morning on his face and the distant noise of the city's traffic that never fully sleeps. He walked 3 blocks in no particular direction, and in those 3 blocks, he did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He thought of his father, of the afternoons at the company when he was 12, and accompanied him to meetings where he learned that powerful adults spoke loudly and others listened in silence, of the way his father taught him, without saying it in words, that the world was divided between those who imposed and those who endured. How much of that learning had he turned into identity without ever questioning it? Clara was right. That was the part that hurt him most. Wednesday, the day between the envelope and the assembly, was the longest day Clara would remember in a long time, not because of the events themselves, which were contained and mostly administrative, but because of what it meant to be in that waiting space where everything was decided but had not yet happened. It was the silence before the final move of the piece, and that silence had its own specific weight. She spent most of the day in Mr. Lee's office, going over the documents one last time, coordinating the logistical details of the assembly, answering the legal team's questions with the methodical precision of someone who wanted to leave no angle uncovered. In the mid-afternoon, Sarah sent her a message from the 38th floor that simply said, "The atmosphere here is strange. Everyone knows something is happening, but no one knows what." Daniel hasn't left his office all day. Clara read the message, put it away, and continued with what she was doing. She had learned long ago that moments of waiting were also moments of preparation, and that preparation was the only honest way to control what could be controlled before facing what could not. That night, alone in her apartment, she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She took a small worn photograph from her bedside table drawer, one she had kept there for years, a photo of her grandfather, Mr. Tan Kian Huat, taken in the garden of his home in Singapore, sitting in his favorite rattan chair, with a book open on his lap, and his gaze directed towards a point outside the frame, with that expression of his, of someone who saw things others had not yet learned to look at. Clara held the photo for a moment, placed it on the bedside table, and turned off the light. Thursday dawned with a clarity that admitted no easy metaphors. It was simply a clear, cold, precise day over Singapore, the kind of morning that promised nothing, but simply existed with a direct honesty Clara found appropriate for what was about to happen. She woke up at 5:30 a.m., long before her alarm went off. She had slept with the strange depth of those who have made a difficult decision and have reached the other side of it. It was not the lightness of one who does not feel the weight of things, but the solidity of one who feels it and has consciously decided to carry it. She made coffee, sat by the window of her apartment in River Valley, and spent 40 minutes in silence, watching the city awaken. She thought of her grandfather, she thought of her mother, she thought of the 300 people who would arrive at the building that morning without knowing that this day was going to be different from all the previous ones. She also thought briefly, and without the bitterness that at another time would have accompanied the thought, of Daniel Chen, of the conversation the night before, of the different voice he had when he called her, and of the different face he had had in the restaurant. It was not compassion she felt, or at least not primarily that. It was something closer to the clarity that comes from seeing people in their real dimension, without the stage, without the performance, without the defense mechanisms we all build around our deepest weaknesses. Daniel Chen was the product of a history he had not chosen and of decisions he had chosen, and both things were true at the same time. What happened from now on, if anything happened, would depend on whether he was capable of separating one thing from the other. That was not Clara's problem. Clara's problem was the one she had today, on this precise and cold day that was already beginning to move behind the windows of her apartment. She arrived at the Straits Ventures Holdings building at 9:30 a.m., not through the employee entrance, as she had for 3 years. She arrived through the main executive lobby, accompanied by Mr. David Lee to her right and a legal assistant carrying 2 briefcases of documents with the silent efficiency of someone perfectly trained for this kind of moment. She wore an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit, her hair simply tied back, and the same moderate heels that resonated calmly on the marble. The only visible difference from any other day was that this time she didn't carry copio in her hand. The lobby security guard recognized her immediately and opened the barrier without asking. The receptionist looked up, processed what he saw with evident confusion, and correctly decided it was not his place to ask questions. 2 employees crossing the lobby at that moment stopped imperceptibly, exchanged a glance, and continued walking with the trained discretion of those who work in an environment where information travels fast, and it's better not to be part of the path. On the 38th floor, Sarah waited by the elevators, the navy blue folder under her arm, and an expression that mixed nerves with a loyalty so solid that Clara felt a genuine warmth in her chest upon seeing her. They looked at each other for a second. Sarah nodded. Clara nodded. They needed nothing more. The main boardroom was already occupied when they entered. The entire board of directors, 5 people who mostly knew Clara from seeing her cross hallways for 3 years but had never had reason to pay her particular attention, sat along one side of the long oak table. 3 of them had expressions that revealed Mr. Lee had contacted them well in advance, so they would arrive informed. The other 2 had the expression of people who had just learned something that forced them to quickly reorganize their understanding of the world. Daniel Chen was sitting at the end of the table, in the place he had always occupied as CEO, with the posture of someone who had made a difficult decision overnight and awoke with it still intact. Marcus Lim was not present. His empty chair eloquently communicated all that needed to be communicated. Clara took her seat at the opposite head of the table, the place that belonged to her as the representative of the majority shareholder, with such complete naturalness that no one in that room could have said it was the first time she had done so. Mr. Lee sat to her right. The legal assistant opened the briefcases with precise movements and began to distribute the document packets prepared for each board member. The silence, as everyone received their documents, had the particular density of moments people recognize as historic, even before they end. "Good morning," Clara said, and her voice filled the room with a calm that needed no volume to have presence. "My name is Clara Tancarillo. I am the granddaughter of Mr. Tan Kian Huat, the original founding partner of this company, and today I represent Tan Kian Huat Investments Pte Limited, holder of 67% of the ordinary shares of Straits Ventures Holdings. Mr. Lee has prepared the complete documentation that accredits this representation, which you will find in the first section of the packets you have just received." No one spoke. 5 pairs of eyes looked at her with an attention different from any attention she had received in 3 years of working in that same building. It was the attention given to someone when the entire context suddenly shifts, and what you thought you knew turns out to be only a fraction of the real picture. The convocation for this extraordinary general meeting was activated by the violation of Clause 14B of the shareholder regulations as a consequence of direct executive actions against this representation that occurred on Monday. Clara continued with the same precise calm. Additionally, and this is the central point of this meeting, we present documented evidence of serious financial irregularities that occurred over the past 8 months in the management of corporate funds. The second section of your packets contains the bank statements, transfer records, documentation of the recipient company, and the independent report from the external auditor who verified the numbers. I ask you to review that section carefully. The sound of pages being turned simultaneously filled the room for the next 4 minutes. Clara waited in silence, hands clasped on the table, without moving, without hurrying, without filling the silence with unnecessary words. In that silence, the 5 board members read the numbers, followed the trail of transfers, arrived at the names of the registered partners in the Panamanian company, and processed the meaning of what was before them, with the particular expression of people being forced to completely revise the image they believed they had of their environment. It was one of the board members, an older man named Mr. Ang Thiam Seng, who had known Mr. Tan Kian Huat personally decades ago, and whose presence on the board was one of those historical threads connecting the present with the past, in ways no one had examined with sufficient care. Who broke the silence first? 4,300,000, he said in a low voice, almost to himself, with the expression of Samalo reading something, hoped never to have had to read. 4,342,000. Mr. Lee confirmed precisely, distributed in 17 transfers over 8 months, all authorized with the signatures that appear in Appendix C. Daniel Chen did not lift his gaze from his documents during that exchange. His posture was not that of a man fighting. It was that of a man who had decided not to fight, who reached that decision during a long and difficult night, and who awoke with it still held in his hands as something fragile but real. When he finally spoke, he did so, looking directly at Clara, ignoring the rest of the room with a concentration that, in that specific context, was the closest thing to respect he had shown towards another person in a long time. I will not contest any of these documents, Daniel said. They are accurate. A pause. I am willing to sign my resignation as CEO with immediate effect, to cooperate fully with any internal or external audit the new board deems necessary, and to agree on a plan for restitution of the diverted funds on terms this representation considers reasonable. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences that morning. It was the silence that comes after something breaks and before the conversation begins about how to rebuild it. Mr. Ang Thiam Seng looked at Clara with an expression that held something of recognition, as if in the granddaughter he was seeing something of the grandfather he remembered, and whose absence had left a void no one had been able to name for years. Mr. Ang rose slowly with the careful movements of his 81 years, and approached Clara with an expression no one else in that room could correctly interpret, but which Clara understood immediately. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying an incomplete story for decades, and had just received the missing chapter. He extended his hand, and she took it. And in that handshake, there was something that went far beyond corporate formality. It was the connection between 2 moments of the same story, separated by 40 years and reunited in that oak room, with morning light streaming through the windows. Ernesto would be proud, Mr. Ang said simply, with the economy of words of someone who had lived long enough to know which ones truly mattered. Clara nodded once, with the same restraint she had learned from her grandfather, and in that small movement was all that could not be contained in words. Clara looked at him for a moment, then looked at the entire board, and when she spoke, she did so with a clarity that had nothing of personal triumph and everything of genuine purpose. This company has 300 people who come every morning to give their best. They have families, projects, career dreams that depend on this working well. What happened with the financial management cannot be repeated, and the corresponding legal consequences will follow their natural course. But the company itself, its fundamentals, its potential, deserves a real opportunity to be what it always could have been with the right direction. She then proposed a restructuring she had designed for weeks with Mr. Lee, clear and actionable, a complete external audit, a new CEO, selected by internal competition with board participation, a supervised financial restitution program, and a complete review of the organizational culture with specialized external support. Sarah, whose loyalty and capability Clara knew better than anyone, would be appointed transition director with executive authority during the period of change. The proposal was complete, detailed, and actionable, the result of weeks of silent work that no one in that room had seen, but which everyone immediately recognized as the work of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment. The board voted. The resolution was unanimous. The vote took less than 4 minutes, 5 hands raised, 5 voices saying yes in the order Mr. Lee called them. There was no additional debate, no objections, no kind of negotiations that these matters usually generate when there are conflicting interests to defend. Because in that room that morning, everyone present understood with perfect clarity what the document said and what the situation required. The text of the resolution was read aloud by Mr. Lee, with his precise diction of 7 decades of legal practice, signed by all board members, and sealed with the silent weight of decisions that changed the course of things. Daniel Chen signed his resignation on the penultimate page, with the pen extended by Mr. Lee's legal assistant, with a hand that did not tremble, but moved with the slowness of someone doing something definitive and irreversible. It was the end of something. And for the 300 people who that afternoon would receive the official communication about the changes in the company's leadership, it would also be, though they didn't yet know it, the beginning of something different. When the assembly ended at 12:47 p.m., Clara walked out of the boardroom into the 38th floor corridor and found something she had not calculated in any of her scenarios: the entire floor. The 300 people Daniel had used as an involuntary audience on Monday were standing, not applauding, not cheering, simply standing in silence, looking at her with a collective expression more powerful than any ovation. There was something in that silence that Clara had not anticipated, and that affected her in a way no strategic outcome had managed to affect her. It was not the satisfaction of a goal accomplished. It was something more difficult to name. It was the weight of being seen by people who had spent years feeling invisible, and who, at that moment, were recognizing in her something that had to do with their own stories, with the times someone had told them they weren't good enough, with the feeling that power was always on the other side of the table. Sarah was at the front with shining eyes and a smile that couldn't fit on her face. Behind her, Daphne, Marcus's assistant, who had arrived that morning with her heart in her throat and who now had the expression of someone who had done something difficult and right and was still processing what that meant. Clara stopped in the middle of the corridor, looked around, and felt something her grandfather had once described to her with words that, at that moment, gained their full weight. True power does not feel like victory, Clara. It feels like responsibility. And if you wield it well, it feels exactly like this. She approached Sarah and hugged her briefly with the natural restraint of someone not accustomed to grand gestures but who recognized moments that deserved them. Then she slowly walked the floor, greeting people by name, looking them in the eyes with the attention she had practiced for 3 years from her more discreet position and which she could now exercise in its full dimension. There was a very young girl from the marketing area named Valentina, who had only been with the company for 6 months, and who that morning looked at the scene with wide eyes and an expression in which Clara recognized something she knew well. The look of someone seeing for the first time that things could be different from how she knew them. Clara stopped in front of her for a moment and simply told her, with the naturalness of an everyday observation, "You have talent. I've seen it." Valentina opened her mouth, closed it, and nodded with a small movement that was worth much more than any speech. These moments, Clara knew, were the ones that lasted not the grand gestures, nor the headlines, nor the corporate victories with their numbers and signed minutes. The moments where one person looks at another and says, "I see you." That is what lasts. And this will not be the last time someone underestimates the wrong person. Here, pride always has consequences, and truth always finds the perfect moment to come to light. Outside, Singapore continued to spin with its usual indifference. The delivery trucks, the traffic lights, cycling, the millions of people moving through their own stories, without knowing or needing to know what had happened on the 38th floor of that glass building. But in that specific space, something had changed forever. A woman who for 3 years had arrived punctually with her copio and her report folders, who had smiled calmly at everyday arrogance, who had remained silent when she had every right to speak, who had been publicly humiliated on a Monday by a man who believed he had everything, had just demonstrated with an elegance that needed no shouts, no revenge, no drama, that real power never needs to announce itself. Late that afternoon, when the official communication arrived in all employees' inboxes announcing the changes in the company's leadership, there was a minute of collective silence on the 38th floor that no corporate protocol had scheduled. 34 people, the same ones who on Monday had been involuntary witnesses to a public humiliation, read the same words on their screens and felt something that also had no exact name, a mixture of relief and something resembling hope. That fragile and tenacious thing that survives in the places where you least expect it. Sarah read it in the language of their bodies, from her desk. The way shoulders dropped, the way some people looked towards the office that had been Daniel's and no longer was. The way the air on the floor seemed, in a way difficult to articulate but completely real, to have a different pressure. She just needed the right moment. And she had waited for hers with the patience of someone who learned from childhood in a garden that smelled of jasmine, sitting next to a man who taught her that the most enduring greatness is built in silence, brick by brick, decision by decision, with intelligence instead of anger, and with purpose instead of revenge, that lions do not need to roar for the jungle to know who is king. Weeks later, when Clara Tan's story began to circulate in the city's business circles, many people tried to reduce it to a simple narrative. The girl who overthrew the CEO, the iris who took revenge, the corporate turnaround of the year. But those who knew her truly, Sarah, Mr. Lee, Mariana, Daphne, MDM, Go with her copio, knew that none of those versions captured the essential. The essential was harder to tell because it lacked the easy drama of revenge or the simple arc of triumph. It was the story of a woman who chose intelligence over anger, patience over haste, and responsibility over power for power's sake. It was the story of what happens when someone decides to honor the best that those who came before left them. Ultimately, it was the story Mr. Tan Kian Huat had begun to write decades ago in his garden in Singapore, between the smell of jasmine and damp earth, and which his granddaughter had finished writing on the 38th floor of a Singapore building, on a clear and cold Thursday, with the same invisible pen used by those who understand that true power makes no noise. She had never roared, and the jungle knew it that Tuesday.